The slap echoed louder than the traffic. People nearby stopped walking. A vendor froze mid-sale. Even the other officers turned their heads. Steven Seagal stood still, his face turned slightly to the side from the impact. The officer who slapped him lowered his hand slowly, chest rising with anger. "You think you can stand here and talk back to us?" The cop snapped. "This is a restricted area." Steven didn't touch his cheek, didn't raise his voice, didn't argue. He simply looked at the officer, calm eyes. Steady breath, no fear. "I said nothing disrespectful," Steven replied quietly. That calmness only made things worse. "What did you say?" The officer barked, stepping closer. "You civilians think you can do whatever you want now?" Another cop chuckled from behind. "Looks like another tough guy who doesn't know his place." The crowd began to grow. Phones slowly came out. People sensed something was wrong, but no one intervened. Steven stood near the steps of the downtown precinct, hands visible, posture relaxed, plain clothes, old jacket. No badge, no escort. To the officers, he looked like just another man who needed to be put in his place. "I'm here for an official meeting," Steven said. The slapping officer laughed loudly. "Yeah, with who?" "The janitor." More laughter. Steven glanced at the building behind them, then back at the officer. "You shouldn't judge people before you know why they're here." That's when the officer's smile disappeared. "You giving me advice now?" He shoved Steven's shoulder. Steven didn't move. That silence, the way he absorbed the shove without reacting, made the officer feel small. And small egos often react with force. The slap came fast, hard, unnecessary. A woman in the crowd gasped. Someone whispered, "That cop didn't have to do that." Steven slowly turned his face back forward. For a moment, the street felt unnaturally quiet. Then Steven spoke, softly, clearly, with absolute control. "Remember this moment," he said, "because it's the one you'll wish you handled differently." The officer scoffed. "You threatening me?" Steven shook his head. "No," he said. "I'm observing." The officers laughed again, but this time, it sounded uncertain. Because there was something about the way he stood, something about the way he spoke. Not angry, not scared, prepared. Sirens wailed in the distance as black vehicles turned onto the street, and Steven Seagal added one final sentence, calm enough to be missed, powerful enough to change everything. "I'm the new chief." And suddenly, no one was laughing anymore. The slap echoed louder than the traffic. People nearby stopped walking. A vendor froze mid-sale. Even the other officers turned their heads. Steven Seagal stood still, his face turned slightly to the side from the impact. The officer who slapped him lowered his hand slowly, chest rising with anger. "You think you can stand here and talk back to us?" The cop snapped. "This is a restricted area." Steven didn't touch his cheek, didn't raise his voice, didn't argue. He simply looked at the officer, calm eyes. Steady breath, no fear. "I said nothing disrespectful," Steven replied quietly. That calmness only made things worse. "What did you say?" The officer barked, stepping closer. "You civilians think you can do whatever you want now?" Another cop chuckled from behind. "Looks like another tough guy who doesn't know his place." The crowd began to grow. Phones slowly came out. People sensed something was wrong, but no one intervened. Steven stood near the steps of the downtown precinct, hands visible, posture relaxed, plain clothes, old jacket. No badge, no escort. To the officers, he looked like just another man who needed to be put in his place. "I'm here for an official meeting," Steven said. The slapping officer laughed loudly. "Yeah, with who?" "The janitor." More laughter. Steven glanced at the building behind them, then back at the officer. "You shouldn't judge people before you know why they're here." That's when the officer's smile disappeared. "You giving me advice now?" He shoved Steven's shoulder. Steven didn't move. That silence, the way he absorbed the shove without reacting, made the officer feel small. And small egos often react with force. The slap came fast, hard, unnecessary. A woman in the crowd gasped. Someone whispered, "That cop didn't have to do that." Steven slowly turned his face back forward. For a moment, the street felt unnaturally quiet. Then Steven spoke, softly, clearly, with absolute control. "Remember this moment," he said. Because it's the one you'll wish you handled differently. The officer scoffed. You threatening me? Steven shook his head. No, he said. I'm observing. The officers laughed again, but this time, it sounded uncertain. Because there was something about the way he stood, something about the way he spoke. Not angry, not scared, prepared. Sirens wailed in the distance as black vehicles turned onto the street, and Steven Seagal added one final sentence. Calm enough to be missed, powerful enough to change everything. I'm the new chief. And suddenly, no one was laughing anymore. The silence after Steven's words was heavier than any shouting match could have been. No sirens, no orders. Just the quiet realization settling into everyone's mind. The slapping officer stood frozen, his face pale, eyes darting from Steven to the lieutenant, then to the officials who had stepped out of the black SUVs. His earlier confidence had evaporated, replaced by something raw and unmistakable, fear. Sir, Chief, I didn't know, he stammered, finally breaking the silence. Steven Seagal didn't answer right away. He walked a few steps toward the precinct entrance, slow and deliberate, as if the entire scene were a training exercise rather than a public confrontation. Every officer instinctively straightened. Years of conditioning kicked in, even for those who had been laughing minutes earlier. Steven stopped and turned back. That excuse, he said calmly, is exactly why this is a problem. The officer swallowed hard. I thought you were just a civilian? Steven finished for him. Exactly. The crowd murmured softly. Steven's voice wasn't loud, but it carried. Tell me something, officer, he continued. How many people have you treated this way because you assumed they had no power? The officer opened his mouth and closed it. There was no safe answer, and neither officer stepped forward, attempting damage control. Chief, with all due respect, things got out of hand. We can handle this internally. Steven's gaze shifted to him. Calm, unreadable. Internally, Steven repeated. Is that what you call a slap on a public street? The officer stepped back. Steven turned toward the officials from internal affairs. Did you see everything? He asked. Yes, sir, one replied. Multiple recordings, civilian witnesses. Steven nodded once. Then he looked back at the slapping officer. You used force without cause, Steven said. You escalated a non-threatening situation, and you humiliated a citizen in front of others. The officer's voice cracked. I was following procedures. Steven shook his head slowly. Number you were following ego. That sentence hit harder than the slap had. Steven took another step closer. Not threatening, not aggressive, just close enough that the officer had to face him fully. Authority, Steven said, isn't proven by how hard you can hit someone. It's proven by how well you can control yourself. The rookie officer in the back lowered his eyes, absorbing every word. Steven turned suddenly to the lieutenant. How long has this officer been on the force? The lieutenant cleared his throat. 7 years, sir. Any prior complaints? The lieutenant hesitated. Steven waited. Yes, sir, the lieutenant admitted. 2 excessive force reports, both resolved. Steven raised an eyebrow. Were solved, he repeated quietly. The crowd shifted again. Steven looked back at the officer. Did you learn anything from those incidents? The officer's hands were shaking now. I thought I did. Steven nodded slowly. Thinking isn't enough. The slapping officer dropped his gaze. I'll apologize right now publicly. Steven paused. For who? He asked. For you, sir. Steven shook his head again. That's your 3rd mistake, he said calmly. You still don't understand who this is about. Steven turned toward the crowd. You don't apologize to rank, he said. You apologize to humanity. The officer looked up, confused. Steven gestured toward a woman in the crowd, the one who had gasped when the slap landed. Her, Steven said. And everyone else who watched you misuse power today. The officer swallowed hard and turned toward the crowd. I'm sorry, he said, his voice breaking. I acted out of anger. I was wrong. Some people nodded, others remained silent. Steven watched closely, not for drama, but for sincerity. Then Steven spoke again. An apology doesn't erase behavior, he said. It only starts the conversation. He turned to internal affairs. This incident, Steven ordered, will be formally reviewed. Badge and weapon surrendered immediately. Officer placed on administrative leave pending investigation. The slapping officer's knees nearly buckled. Yes, sir, he whispered. Steven then looked around at the other officers. Let this be clear, he said. No badge gives you permission to forget you're human. His eyes landed briefly on the rookie again. And no silence protects you from responsibility. The rookie swallowed and nodded, understanding the message. The conflict wasn't loud. It wasn't violent. But it was absolute. Because power had just shifted, not through force, but through truth. And everyone there knew the next decisions would define the department's future. The street no longer felt like a street. It felt like a courtroom. No judge's bench, no gavel. Just truth standing in plain clothes. The slapping officer stood off to the side now, badge and service weapon resting in an evidence tray held by internal affairs. His shoulders slumped, not from humiliation, but from the weight of consequences finally catching up. Steven Seagal watched him quietly, not with anger, not with satisfaction, with assessment. Around them, officers shifted uneasily. Some stared at the ground. Others stared at Steven, trying to understand what kind of leader had just stepped into their world. This wasn't the shouting, chest, pounding authority they were used to. This was something colder, sharper. Steven turned to the assembled officers. Look around, he said calmly. This didn't start with a slap. Several heads lifted. It started, Steven continued, with small moments you convinced yourselves didn't matter. He gestured toward the precinct doors. The tone you use, the jokes you laugh at, the complaints you dismiss because paperwork is inconvenient. The lieutenant swallowed. Steven's voice remained even, but every word cut. Abuse of power doesn't arrive all at once, he said. It grows quietly, protected by loyalty to the wrong things. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Steven stepped closer to the line of officers. I didn't come here to tear this department down, he said. I came to find out if it's worth building up. That line made several officers stiffen. One of them, a veteran with graying hair, finally spoke. With respect, Chief, he said carefully. We work under pressure. People don't see what we deal with. Steven met his gaze. You're right, Steven said. They don't. He paused. That's why your restraint matters more than your frustration. The veteran nodded slowly. Steven turned back toward the slapping officer, who now stood surrounded by officials, his earlier arrogance completely gone. Officer, Steven said. The man looked up, eyes red. 7 years on the force, Steven continued. That's long enough to know the difference between control and cruelty. Yes, sir, the officer whispered. Steven nodded once. You'll have a chance to speak during the investigation, he said. Not here. The officer lowered his head. Steven then turned to internal affairs. I want a full audit, he ordered. Use of force reports, complaint resolutions, supervisory approvals. Yes, Chief, an official replied, already taking notes. The lieutenant shifted nervously, Steven noticed. You approved those resolved complaints, Steven said. The lieutenant stiffened. Yes, sir. Steven didn't accuse him. He didn't raise his voice. He simply said, We'll talk. That was enough. The crowd had grown massive now. News vans pulled up. Reporters whispered into microphones. The moment had outgrown the street. Steven glanced at the cameras. Record this, he said calmly. The noise softened. This department will be judged, Steven continued. Not by how it treats criminals, but by how it treats the innocent. A woman in the crowd wiped her eyes. Steven's gaze softened slightly. I don't expect perfection, he said. I expect accountability. He looked back at the officers. If that scares you, Steven added, you're in the wrong uniform. The rookie officer stepped forward suddenly. Chief, he said, voice nervous but clear. I reported misconduct last year. Nothing happened. The street froze again. The lieutenant turned sharply. Steven raised a hand, stopping him. Thank you, Steven said to the rookie. Those 2 words meant more than a medal. Steven faced internal affairs. That report, he said, will be revisited. The rookie exhaled, years of frustration releasing in one breath. Steven looked back at the rest of the officers. Silence isn't neutrality, he said. It's permission. The message landed hard. Steven then took a step back, surveying the scene one final time. The officers who had laughed, the ones who stayed silent, the civilians who had watched. This, Steven said quietly, is how change begins. Not with sirens, not with speeches, but with one moment that refuses to be ignored. And the city would feel the impact long after the street returned to normal. The air shifted again, but this time it wasn't tense. It was heavy with realization. The cameras were rolling non-stop now. News reporters whispered urgently into microphones. Civilians stood shoulder to shoulder, knowing they were witnessing something rare. Not a scandal being covered up, but one being confronted in real time. Steven Seagal turned away from the crowd and walked toward the precinct doors. Every officer instinctively parted to make space, not because they were ordered to, because authority had finally been redefined. Steven stopped at the entrance and looked back. This doesn't end on the street, he said calmly. It begins here. He stepped inside. The officers followed, some hesitant, some resolute, some visibly shaken. The lobby, usually loud with ringing phones and idle chatter, fell silent the moment Steven entered. He removed his jacket and placed it neatly over a chair. Then he faced them. I want everyone who witnessed the incident in the briefing room, Steven said. Now. No one questioned him. Inside the briefing room, officers lined the walls. Some stood. Others sat stiffly. The slapping officer remained outside, escorted by internal affairs, his future now out of his hands. Steven stood at the front, not behind a podium, not elevated eye level. That slap, Steven began, was not an accident. No one spoke. It was a decision, he continued. A decision shaped by habits that have been ignored for years. He walked slowly across the room. You don't wake up one day and abuse power, Steven said. You practice it in small ways, until it feels normal. Several officers shifted uncomfortably. Steven stopped in front of the lieutenant. You resolved 2 complaints against that officer, Steven said calmly. The lieutenant nodded. Yes, Chief. Why? The lieutenant hesitated. Pressure, staffing shortages, the belief that discipline would hurt morale. Steven nodded once. That belief, he said, hurts morale far more than accountability ever will. He turned to the group. Good officers leave bad departments, Steven said, and bad officers stay where they're protected. The words settled deep. Steven then looked directly at the veteran officer who had spoken earlier on the street. You said people don't see what you deal with, Steven said. The veteran nodded. I agree, Steven continued. But stress explains behavior. It doesn't excuse it. The veteran lowered his head slightly respectfully. Steven turned toward the rookie. You spoke up today, Steven said. That takes courage. The rookie swallowed. I just didn't want it to happen again, sir. Steven nodded. That's why you'll be staying, he said, and why others won't. A murmur moved through the room. Steven raised a hand. Let me be clear, he said. This is not a purge, it's a reset. He stepped back and addressed everyone. Effective immediately, Steven said. All use of force reports will be reviewed by an independent panel. Some officers exchanged glances. Supervisors will be held accountable for what they approve, Steven continued. Silence will no longer be rewarded. The room was still. I'm not here to be liked, Steven said calmly. I'm here to restore trust. He paused. And trust, he added, starts with consequences. A senior official entered quietly and handed Steven a folder. Steven opened it, skimmed the contents, then closed it. The officer involved will face a formal hearing, Steven announced. His badge does not shield him from the law. No cheers, no applause. Just acceptance. Steven looked around one last time. Some of you will disagree with what I do, he said. That's fine. He walked toward the door. But no one will ever again say they didn't know where I stand. As he left the briefing room, the officers remained silent. Not out of fear, but because for the first time in a long time leadership had spoken clearly. Outside, the city waited. And inside the department, everything had changed. By morning, the city was already buzzing. Clips of the incident had spread everywhere. Phones, news channels, social media feeds, the slap, the silence. The moment Steven Seagal calmly said, "I'm the new chief," people argued online, debated motives, chose sides. Inside the precinct, however, there was no debate. There was work. Steven arrived early just as he had the day before. No sirens, no escort. Just a quiet entrance through the front doors. Officers noticed immediately. Word traveled fast. "He's here already." Briefings were shorter now, sharper. Steven stood at the head of the morning command meeting, reviewing reports without theatrics. When he spoke, it was measured, never more than necessary. "The officer involved is officially suspended pending a full disciplinary hearing," he said. "No exceptions, no shortcuts." The room was silent. "And for the record," Steven added, "this investigation will be transparent. If mistakes were made at higher levels, they will be addressed." Several supervisors shifted in their seats. After the meeting, Steven walked the halls. He didn't summon officers to his office. They found him where they worked, at desks, in break rooms, in hallways that hadn't seen leadership in years. Some avoided eye contact. Others nodded respectfully. One officer finally spoke up. "Chief, people say you embarrassed the department." Steven stopped walking. "I didn't embarrass the department," he said calmly. "I revealed it." The officer nodded slowly, unsure whether to feel relieved or exposed. Later that day, the rookie officer was called into Steven's office. He entered nervously. "You wanted to see me, sir." Steven gestured to a chair. "You spoke up," Steven said. "That's not easy." The rookie nodded. "I almost didn't." Steven leaned back slightly. "Most people don't," he said. "That's how bad systems survive." He slid a folder across the desk. "I'm assigning you to a new community oversight unit," Steven said. "You'll work directly with internal affairs." The rookie's eyes widened. "Sir, are you sure?" Steven nodded. "I don't promote silence, I promote courage." When the rookie left, his posture was different, straighter. Across the city, the suspended officer sat at home, replaying the moment again and again. The slap, the stare, the sentence that had changed everything. For the first time in his career, there was no union rep smoothing things over. No supervisor promising it would go away. It wouldn't. That afternoon, Steven stood before a small group of reporters. He didn't grandstand. He didn't defend himself. "This department will earn trust," he said, "or it will lose authority." A reporter shouted, "Chief, are you trying to make an example?" Steven paused. "No," he replied. "I'm trying to set a standard." That night, Steven walked the streets, not with a camera crew, not announced. He spoke to shop owners, listened to residents, heard stories that had been buried for years. Fear, frustration, hope. He took notes, not names, patterns. Back at the precinct, officers watched quietly as he returned. No one knew what tomorrow would bring. But everyone knew one thing: things would not return to how they were. The department wasn't suddenly perfect, but it was awake. And as Steven looked out from his office window at the city below, he understood something clearly. Real authority doesn't come from rank. It comes from responsibility. Tomorrow, the work would continue. But tonight, for the first time in a long while, the badge felt like something that had to be earned again. By the end of the week, the city felt different. Not quieter, not calmer, but more aware. People still hurried through the streets. Sirens still echoed at night. Crime didn't magically disappear, but something subtle had shifted. Something deeper than headlines. People were watching again. Inside the department, officers felt it too. Every interaction now carried weight. Every decision felt heavier, not because of fear, but because excuses no longer worked. The badge meant scrutiny, and scrutiny meant responsibility. Steven Seagal didn't celebrate the change. He didn't give victory speeches. He didn't claim credit. In fact, he said very little. Because the lesson wasn't about him. It was about a moment. A moment when power revealed itself, not through authority, but through behavior. The slap that started it all was already fading from the news cycle, but its meaning wasn't. People replayed the footage again and again, not to see the strike, but to see what came after. The stillness, the restraint, the choice not to react with anger. That was the real shock. Because in a world addicted to loud responses, calm accountability feels revolutionary. Steven addressed the department one final time that week. No cameras, no reporters, just officers. "Most of you will never be famous," he said quietly. "You won't be thanked. You won't go viral for doing your job right." He paused. "But every day someone will decide whether to trust this uniform based on how you act in moments no one records." Eyes stayed locked on him. "You don't need to know who someone is to treat them with dignity," Steven continued. "And if respect only appears when power walks into the room, then it was never real." Some officers nodded, others looked uncomfortable. That was okay. Growth usually is. Steven finished with one final sentence. "Authority doesn't begin when people fear you. It begins when they believe you." Then he walked out. Outside the precinct, life went on. People argued online, comment sections filled with opinions. Some said the officer deserved forgiveness. Others said he deserved punishment. But most people agreed on one thing. The slap wasn't the real story. The response was, because anyone can lose control. But it takes strength to hold it. Anyone can wear a uniform. But not everyone deserves what it represents. Respect isn't about rank, it's about restraint. And power isn't proven by force, it's proven by fairness. So the next time you're tempted to judge someone by their clothes, their silence, or their status, remember this: you never know who you're standing in front of. More importantly, you never know who you're becoming in that moment. If you believe respect should be given before it's demanded, type respect in the comments. And tell me where you're watching from. I want to hear from people who believe real strength is quiet, calm, and accountable. Faye.